In just 47 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved actors went from smiling guest to walking off set in fury. What started as light-hearted banter turned into a brutal showdown when Janet Street Porter crossed a line that left Michael Caine speechless, the studio audience gasping, and the nation watching in shock as the legendary star told her exactly what he thought before storming out. If you want daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals and the moments TV doesn't want you to see, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a celebration. Michael Caine, the man behind Alfie, The Italian Job, and the Dark Knight trilogy, was there to talk about his incredible career spanning 7 decades. The studio audience was packed, the energy was high, and everyone expected a warm conversation filled with stories from Hollywood's golden age. What they got instead was one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. Michael walked onto the set to massive applause. He was wearing his signature glasses and a smart blazer, waving to the crowd with that famous Cockney charm that made him a working-class hero. The panel greeted him warmly. Ruth Langsford was there. Colleen Nolan was smiling. And Janet Street Porter sat at the end of the desk with her notepad, ready to jump in. Everything seemed normal at first. Ruth started the conversation by asking Michael about his early days in London, growing up in Rotherhithe during the war. Michael's face lit up as he talked about his mum, his childhood, and how he never dreamed a kid from South London could make it in movies. The audience was eating it up. He was funny, humble, and full of life. Everyone was laughing along with him. Then Janet Street Porter leaned forward. She had this look on her face, the kind of look that says she's about to ask something she thinks is clever. She interrupted Michael mid-sentence and said, "But Michael, let's be honest. You've had it pretty easy, haven't you? I mean, you're a white man in Hollywood. The doors were already open for you." The studio went quiet. Michael stopped talking and turned to look at her. You could see his expression change. The smile faded a bit, but he kept his cool. He said, "Easy? I don't know about that, Janet. I slept on floors. I went hungry. I worked in a factory before I got my first role. Nothing was handed to me." Janet wasn't backing down. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, come on, Michael. You know what I mean. You didn't have to fight against the system like women did, like people of color did. You walked into an industry built for men like you." Ruth tried to step in. She said, "Janet, I think what Michael's saying is that his journey had its own struggles." But Janet talked right over her. She kept her eyes locked on Michael and said, "I'm just saying, let's not pretend it was some heroic rise from nothing. You had advantages." Michael shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. He said, "Janet, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. I didn't have advantages. I had talent, and I worked my backside off for 50 years. The tension was building. You could feel it in the room." Colleen looked uncomfortable. The audience was silent. Janet, though, seemed to be enjoying herself. She leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, I think we can agree to disagree on that one." Michael shook his head slowly. He said, "No, I don't think we can. You're sitting here trying to diminish everything I've done because of what? Because I'm a man? That's rubbish, Janet, and you know it." Janet's face changed. She didn't like being challenged. She sat up straighter and said, "I'm not diminishing anything. I'm just bringing some reality to this conversation. You've been celebrated your whole life. Some of us had to fight for every scrap of recognition." Michael let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. He said, "You think I wasn't fighting? You think every role just fell into my lap? I got rejected hundreds of times. I was told I wasn't good-looking enough. I wasn't posh enough. My accent was wrong. But I kept going. That's not privilege, Janet. That's bloody hard work." Ruth tried again to calm things down. She said, "I think we can all agree that everyone's journey is different and valid." But it was too late. The fire was already burning. Janet wasn't finished. She pointed her pen at Michael and said, "But you were still a man, Michael. You still got paid more. You still got better roles. You still didn't have to worry about being too old or too ugly or too difficult. That's just a fact." Michael's face went red. He said, "What are you on about? I got paid what I was worth. I earned every pound. And as for being too old, have you seen the roles they give to older men versus older women? That's the industry, not me. I didn't make those rules." Janet shot back, But you benefited from them, didn't you? You've been working into your 80s while actresses your age were put out to pasture decades ago. Michael's voice got louder. He said, "So that's my fault, is it? I should apologize for still being employed? For still being good at what I do? This is ridiculous." The audience was completely frozen. Some people looked shocked. Others looked like they wanted to leave. Ruth's eyes were wide. Colleen was staring down at the desk, and Janet was smirking. She actually had a little smile on her face, like she was proud of herself for rattling him. She said, "I'm just saying, Michael, maybe it's time men like you acknowledge the privilege you've had, instead of acting like you climbed Everest barefoot." That was it. That was the moment everything exploded. Michael took off his microphone and put it on the desk. He said, "You know what, Janet? I've been in this business since before you could spell Hollywood. I've met prime ministers, presidents, and royalty. And I've never met anyone as rude and disrespectful as you." Janet's smirk disappeared. She said, "Excuse me?" Michael stood up. He said, "You heard me. You invited me here to talk about my career. And instead you've spent the whole time trying to tear me down. Why? To make yourself feel better? To score some points with people watching at home? It's pathetic." Janet stood up too. Her voice got sharp. She said, "I'm pathetic? You're the one who can't handle a little bit of truth. You've been coasting on your reputation for years, Michael, and you can't stand it when someone calls you out." Michael's voice boomed across the studio. He said, "Calls me out? For what? For being successful? For working hard? You don't know the first thing about me or what I've been through. You sit here on your talk show, throwing around accusations, acting like you're some kind of warrior for justice. But all you are is bitter." The audience gasped. Someone in the back let out a small scream. Ruth stood up and tried to get between them. She said, "Okay, let's all take a breath. This is getting out of hand." But Janet wasn't stopping. She pointed at Michael and said, "How dare you call me bitter? I've fought for everything I have. I've broken down doors in an industry that tried to keep women like me out. You don't get to lecture me about hard work." Michael laughed again, that same harsh laugh. He said, "Oh, here we go. The victim card. You've had a 30-year career on television, Janet. You've written books. You've been on every panel show in Britain. But apparently, you're still a victim. Give me a break." Janet's face was bright red now. She said, "And you've had a 60-year career where you've been worshipped and adored and paid millions while people like me had to beg for scraps. So forgive me if I don't bow down to the great Michael Caine." Michael stepped closer to the desk. He said, "I never asked you to bow down. I asked you to show some basic respect. But clearly, that's too much for you." Janet shot back. "Respect? You want respect? Then maybe you should respect the women who paved the way for equality in this industry, instead of pretending like you did it all on your own." Michael's voice dropped. It got quieter, but somehow more intense. He said, "I've never once said I did it on my own. I've thanked my directors, my co-stars, my family in every speech I've ever given. But I'm not going to stand here and apologize for being a man. I'm not going to apologize for being successful. And I'm definitely not going to listen to you rewrite history to fit your agenda." The other panelists were completely silent. Ruth looked like she wanted to cry. Colleen was frozen. A producer off camera was making frantic hand gestures, trying to signal for a commercial break, but the cameras kept rolling. Janet crossed her arms. She said, "My agenda? What agenda is that, Michael?" Michael said, "The one where you tear down anyone who doesn't agree with you. The one where you twist everything into some political statement. You can't just have a conversation anymore. Everything has to be a battle. Everything has to be about who's more oppressed, who suffered more, who deserves more sympathy. It's exhausting." Janet's voice went cold. She said, "You know what's exhausting? Listening to privileged men like you complain about being held accountable. You've lived your entire life without anyone questioning you. And the second someone does, you fall apart." Michael picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He said, "I'm not falling apart, Janet. I'm walking away. Because life's too short to waste time arguing with someone who's already made up their mind about me without knowing a damn thing." Ruth quickly said, "Michael, please, don't go. We can move on. We can talk about something else." But Michael shook his head. He said, "No, Ruth. I'm done. I came here to have a nice chat. maybe share some stories, make people laugh. But instead, I got ambushed by someone with an axe to grind. I don't need this, Janet said. Oh, so you're running away? How typical. Can't handle the heat. So you leave. Michael turned to face her one last time. He said, I'm not running away. I'm choosing not to engage with someone who has no interest in a real conversation. You wanted to make me the villain from the moment I sat down. Well, congratulations, Janet. You got your moment. I hope it was worth it. Janet said, it was absolutely worth it. Because now, everyone can see what you're really like when someone challenges you. Michael's voice was steady but firm. He said, what I'm really like. I'm a man who's worked his whole life, treated people with respect, and tried to do good work. If you see that as a problem, that says a lot more about you than it does about me. He started walking toward the exit. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. Most of them just sat there with their mouths open. Ruth called after him, Michael, please! But he kept walking. Janet shouted, yeah, walk away. That's what men like you do when you can't control the narrative. Michael stopped at the edge of the set. He didn't turn around. He just said, loud enough for everyone to hear, you're a piece of work, Janet. Truly. Then he was gone. He walked straight through the studio doors and out into the corridor. The cameras stayed on the panel. Janet was standing there, her chest heaving, her face still red. Ruth sat back down, her hand over her mouth. Colleen looked like she was in shock. The producer finally managed to signal for a commercial break, and the screen cut to an advertisement. But the damage was done. The clip was already being uploaded. Social media was exploding. People were taking sides. Some said Michael was right to walk off. Others said Janet had every right to challenge him. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had never seen anything like that on daytime television before. In the studio, after the cameras cut away, Janet sat down. She didn't say anything. Ruth looked at her and said quietly, that got out of hand? Janet didn't respond. She just stared at the empty chair where Michael had been sitting, her notepad still in front of her, her pen clenched in her hand. The audience was being led out of the studio. They were all talking at once, pulling out their phones, already texting their friends about what they'd just witnessed. The producers were in a panic, running around trying to figure out how to handle the rest of the show. One of them suggested they bring in a guest who was scheduled for next week. Another suggested they just do a cooking segment and pretend nothing happened. But it was too late for that. The confrontation was already the biggest story of the day. News outlets were picking it up. Entertainment websites were writing articles with headlines like, Legendary actor walks off loose, women after explosive row, and Janet Street Porter accused of attacking Michael Caine. The video was being shared thousands of times every minute. Back on the set, Ruth tried to gather herself. She took a sip of water and said to the other panelists, we need to finish the show. We have 20 minutes left. Colleen nodded slowly. Janet still hadn't said anything. She looked angry, but there was something else there too. Maybe regret, maybe embarrassment. It was hard to tell. When they came back from commercial, Ruth addressed the cameras. She said, as you just saw, we had a bit of a disagreement with our guest, and he's decided to leave. We respect his decision, and we're going to move on with the rest of the show. Her voice was shaky. She was trying to sound professional, but everyone could tell she was rattled. Janet finally spoke. She said, I stand by everything I said. If people can't handle being challenged, that's their problem. Her voice was defiant, but there was a crack in it. Ruth gave her a look that said, not now. But Janet ignored it. They tried to continue with the show. They talked about a news story involving a celebrity divorce. They did a segment on holiday destinations. But the energy was completely dead. The audience was barely responding. The panelists seemed distracted. Everyone knew that nothing else mattered. The only thing people would remember from this episode was the fight. Outside the studio, Michael Caine was already in his car. His agent was on the phone, fielding calls from journalists. Michael sat in the back seat, looking out the window. He wasn't angry anymore. He just looked tired. He'd been in the industry long enough to know how these things went. Tomorrow, there would be think pieces. There would be debates on morning shows. People would dissect every word he said, every expression on his face. But right now, he just wanted to go home. He'd said what he needed to say. He'd stood up for himself. and he'd walked away with his dignity intact. That was more than a lot of people could say after an encounter with Janet Street Porter. Inside the studio, the show finally wrapped. The cameras stopped rolling. The crew started packing up equipment. Ruth and Colleen left the set quickly, not wanting to stick around for the inevitable post-show debriefing. Janet stayed in her seat for a moment longer. She looked at the empty chair across from her, the microphone Michael had left on the desk, and the glass of water he'd never touched. A producer approached her cautiously. He said, "Janet, we need to talk about what happened." She stood up, grabbed her bag and said, "Not now." Then she walked off the set, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving behind a studio full of shocked staff and a controversy that would dominate headlines for days. The audience filed out into the cold evening air, still buzzing with excitement and disbelief. They'd come expecting a light-hearted chat with a movie legend. Instead, they'd witnessed a television moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and argued about for weeks to come. Some of them felt bad for Michael. Some of them thought Janet had made good points. But all of them knew they'd just seen something extraordinary. Something raw and real in a world of carefully scripted television. As the studio emptied and the lights dimmed, the only evidence of what had happened was the video footage already spreading across the internet like wildfire. Michael Caine, one of Britain's most treasured actors, had walked off a talk show after a confrontation that exposed the deep divisions and tensions bubbling beneath the surface of polite television conversation. And Janet Street Porter, never one to back down from a fight, had pushed a guest too far and paid the price. The empty set sat in silence, the chairs still warm, the microphones still live, waiting for the next day's show. But everyone knew that tomorrow would be different. The producers would be more careful. The questions would be safer. The guests would be more cautious. Because, after what happened with Michael Caine, nobody wanted to risk another confrontation like that. But for one brief, explosive moment, the cameras had captured something real, something unscripted, something that reminded everyone watching that even in the controlled world of daytime television, emotions can boil over, words can cut deep, and sometimes, the only response is to stand up and walk away.